Hi, this is Mike Marshall, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Mike Marshall, who I've chatted to before, but any excuse to chat to Mike again is great. And the excuse we have this time is that Into the Cauldron, the duets record he made with Chris Thile, is 20 years old this year. And I wanted to celebrate that because it's a record I love, and I know it's a record a lot of you love. So we're going to have a chat about that. Mike, welcome back.
Oh, it's good to be back here, Matt. Thank you so much for shining a light on this thing I'd almost forgotten about. It's been so long, 20 years, hard to believe. But yeah, it was a very important record for me, and hopefully Chris too, and we had a ball doing it. So nice to revisit it.
Yeah, and I'd love to chat about the record in detail, but I'd really like to start off with just sort of where you guys were in your individual journeys at that point, because Chris had sort of done a couple of Nickel Creek records, and he'd done some of the solo stuff like Not All Who Wander Are Lost, but this was his first sort of duet project.
That's really true, huh?
Yeah, and I'd just be curious to know sort of where you were, because the album you did with Hamilton de la Hollander didn't come out until a few years after this, did it?
That's right. I went on this journey of doing duet records with a bunch of great mandolin players. Chris, of course, I'd done a lot of duets in the past with Daryl Anger. But then, yeah, Chris, and then Hamilton, and then, of course, Katerina and I have done a few. So, yeah, I guess Chris was pretty early on in his career with Nickel Creek, a couple of albums into it. I mean, they were definitely rock stars in their own right already. And he had moved to San Francisco. I'm not sure if he was actually living there, though, when we did this recording. I don't think he was, but he did live there for a short time, only a couple of years maybe. But we, when we met, we immediately hit it off right away, of course, because we were so obsessed with the mandolin, and particularly with such a wide palette of musical styles that we were both into. And I mean, there's no question that Chris was pushing the boundaries of what technically anybody thought possible on the instrument. So I gravitated towards just hanging out with him, and we just bounced off each other like crazy, like two kids in a sandbox. So deciding to do the record was pretty instantaneous, and we simply went at it without any material. We actually went in the studio. The studio was my garage at home, and just started throwing ideas at each other at what might be possible while rolling tape. It was actually sort of one in the same. It wasn't like we rehearsed for weeks and went out and played gigs and developed this repertoire and then recorded it. We just went at it and, started recording as we arranged. So I know that he had an interest in classical music and had just discovered Glenn Gould and playing Bach on the mandolin. And so that had always been an interest to me. We were sharing a lot of ideas about how to play Bach on the mandolin and fingerings and things like that. We were super inspired by Glenn Gould's recordings of the Goldbergs. And of course, he had been a fan of a lot of the music I had recorded previously, me being, I don't know how old Chris is right now. Are we about 20 years apart? I think so.
I think he was born in 81. That's what's in my head. So
I'm in 57. So anyway, Chris is just such a phenomenon. He's definitely a one-in-a-generation talent in any musical genre. One of the greatest to ever play this instrument. Almost superhuman talent. He will definitely be a force for the future of the American mandolin. Every young kid that has come up since him has been inspired by him. So I'd like to think that, he's just a continuum of stuff that Sam Bush and David Grisman started, and I continued the torch with, maybe broadened it out a little bit. And Chris took some of those ideas and just ran with it. One of the things that catches my attention is just how creative he is. I mean, we all know he has super duper skills and can play fast and wow us with those triplets and all of that stuff. But more interesting to me is how creative he is with just thinking musically, thinking creatively. Outside of the usual traditions that have come before, so it was great to be close to that and work together on something.
And I think that's really interesting because I think with musicians, like, technique is very rarely just there to be technique. It's there because somebody's curious and has had some questions and gone, I wonder if, I wonder how. And so the technique comes as a resolution of those questions, like finding how you do this on your instruments. And so somebody like Bela on banjo or Jerry Douglas on dobro, they're similar kind of, I want to do this, so I will find a place on my instrument for it. And you've done lots of this over the years.
I've always been interested in that, like especially as a mandolin, had not been so explored as an instrument in America beyond traditional music. The classical tradition had almost had been forgotten to a degree compared to how rich that is here in Germany, for instance. Being married to Katerina and knowing all about the history of the mandolin now, I kind of learned it after meeting her 40 years after playing the instrument. I learned what a great tradition there is for this instrument. But as an American mandolinist, you don't think of that tradition so much. Here we are coming out of a folk tradition and saying to ourselves, gee, what is possible? Can I play jazz on this instrument? Oh, there's Jethro Burns. Okay, yeah, sure, kind of, yeah. Is it possible to play classical music on this thing? Technically, what skills will I need to pull off the cross-picking section in the E major partita? I was asking myself those questions in 1978. And so, it's great to find a like-minded musician who also wanted to just dedicate himself to the instrument and push at the boundaries of what anybody ever thought was possible. It's my way of thinking about music, for sure.
Well, and I think with this record, so an album, there's a challenge in an album of all instrumental music in holding people's attention in a way that there maybe isn't when you've got vocals and lyrics, but also when you've got two of the same instruments, which is not an instrument people are necessarily used to listening to 12 at the same time. So variety becomes such a thing, and it's there in the material. You've got, a super traditional tune like Fisher's Hornpipe through to Bach, through to Scrapple from the Apple, through to your original tunes. Like, there's a bit of everything in there. But also the variety in terms of how you approach them instrumentally. So the variety of sound and text, I think texture is maybe the word I'm looking for. The variety of texture on that record is extraordinary for two identical instruments.
It was something that we were very conscious of from the beginning and actually talked about. Like, how can we make each song completely different than the last one? Either dynamically or harmonically or rhythmically. I mean, all the tools you have to work with as a musician. Yes, it's just two mandolins. Okay, so that's our challenge. And we talked about it right from the beginning. We approached it that way. Not every tune has to be a fiddle tune with a fast fiddle tune with a lot of soloing, which is our natural background and an easy go-to for us. So variety was key. Of course, I have the mandocello, which gave us a range and some low end. But when I look through the material, that's what we were talking about. Even down to that last tune, what was it called? The Irish ballad thing, Shamrock Shore.
Yeah.
Let's do one with all harmonics, just to create yet another sound on the record.
And I was talking to Jarrod Walker about this when I spoke to him about this record, and you get, like, you've gone through 9 tracks of huge variety, and then you get What a Blast, and then you get Shamrock Shore. And it's like, the 2 entirely different places you've gone just with those 2 after a huge amount of variety to start with. So it's sort of, it's relentless variety, which is what keeps it such a deep listening experience, I think.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Yeah, What a Blast. That was me. I don't know where I got that idea. The idea is that you let the DNA strings, the middle strings of the mandolin drone, and you play the outside pairs are your melody and harmony. And so you're strumming all 4 strings at once. It's the loudest a mandolin can be. And it's got this rock and roll like vibe. And, and Chris automatically got it and came up with a way to cross-pick through those chords in a real interesting way. So to create another texture. And then to follow it with something so sweet and delicate. Yeah, contrast is the key. David Grisman used to always preach that. Hey, man, something can't be loud unless it was followed by something quiet. And how right he was,
And in the sort of the digital age, the way that we record music and listen to music and mix music and master music has just created this world where everything's louder than everything else.
Yeah.
And I think that's why people crave acoustic music, because you get dynamics and space.
Yeah, unfortunately, even a lot of acoustic musicians are with Pro Tools and these recording devices, we can squash the dynamics out of a record. You can mix it so that it's flat and everything is always being heard. It kind of bothers me a little bit when I go back and listen to some of those recordings that were made to tape and had to be mixed in one day. And they're far from perfect, but God, are they ever perfect, because some things are dipping into the background for a moment and other things coming forward. And that's what real music making is more like. Now we can control it so much that we can compress the life out of it. We have to be careful of that. Sometimes when I listen to Sirius XM, I kind of get the willies, actually, because I don't know whether it's a product of the Nashville recording studio scene or if they're actually compressing it somehow coming out of the satellite that makes it sound like that. But it's different than putting on an LP at home.
Yeah, and the range of ways we listen to music now, like, we used to mix stuff on decent studio monitors and hope people would listen to it on headphones or a decent hi-fi, and now stuff could be coming out of a tiny phone speaker, it could be coming out of, there's the range of situations you have to mix and compress for.
Yeah, it's really a shame, isn't it? We used to be so obsessed with that. I remember Tony Rice, him and his stereo, he had this giant tube audio system at his house, and we would all just gather around and listen to these giant speakers and LP of Oscar Peterson and Niels Henning Orsted. And he was so into that. And I remember when the digital thing started, he almost just sort of drifted into the background. No thanks, Yeah. It's just another world now, isn't it? Everybody has it on there. At least these headphones are sounding pretty good, though. I have those little iPod things. They don't even have cables attached to them. And I'm kind of amazed how much low end they can get out of those things.
Yeah. And that's an interesting, there's an interesting segue there when you've got 2 mandolins playing a duet to talk about low end, because presumably, having played with Darryl Anger in a duet form before, you've got 2 instruments with similar ranges. So you've got a bit of experience in how you sort of use that to your advantage?
Yeah, that's funny that you would mention that, because I wrote that in my notes that, obviously one is the first thing that catches people's attention is how fast and how fluid both Chris and I were at improvising, let's say. But what's more interesting to me is how we backed each other up and how we were super conscious of supporting the other person, even though we only had this limited range to work with. We're conscious of the fact that we're missing a bass player, we're missing a guitar player, we're missing all that sustain. And so let's try to create that. Let's not just play backbeats like we would if we were in a bluegrass band. And so I think you hear a lot of that if you listen to the way we're accompanying each other. And certainly that was something I had to confront for years with Daryl before coming to this record. So I think Chris automatically picked up on that. And
the backup playing is, I mean, it all is on a continuum, isn't it? Is that you are playing lead and you are playing backup, but the lead and the backup are almost interchangeable, like something like Fisher's hornpipe, where you're both, it is that you're at some point on this continuum at all times, but you're very rarely entirely at one end of it.
Yeah, maybe so. I obviously we're heavily arranged, all this music, There's harmony, there's counterpoint, there's chords, there's stops in some sections. Rarely do one or the other of us stop playing. I think we're always playing. One of us, both of us is always playing. But you just use all the parts of music making that are available, and sometimes full unison is great, and then to follow it with harmony, and then to bring in the counterpoint the last time we were very conscious of that. I think we have natural ability to understand what's going to create a balanced arrangement.
And did you sort of work on a track at a time, sort of arrange it, record it, then go to another one?
Yeah, that was the process. We learned the tune, arranged it, recorded it, and then said, okay, now what do you want to do? Oh, I got this Brazilian thing, Desvarada. And I think Chris literally learned it that day, and we recorded it that day, which is kind of insane. It's the kind of piece somebody works on for a month or so. Most normal mandolin players.
It's got that real sort of showstopper quality about it, hasn't it? I remember first time I heard it, it was a little bit like, they're very different pieces, but the first time I heard Dave Apollon play Shardas, it's got that kind of, it's almost like it's a set piece, isn't it? It's got that quality to it.
Well, it is. Although we did improvise on the sections at different points, but I think just the A section. But yeah, I mean, that ending with those triplets, that's definitely entering into the superhuman realm of what's possible on these instruments. Although, what's funny about that is the next generation, they'll learn that when they're 15 years old, just like I learned Sam Bush solos at that age, and they'll take, somebody will take it to another level. And that's a pretty beautiful thing about music. And every once in a while, a unicorn comes along, of which,
and that's the joy of
Chris is,
Yeah, and it's the joy also of talking about a record like this 20 years on, because obviously it's 20 years on for you. I don't think I'd heard it as it came out. I think I maybe heard it 5 years later. But there's people will hear it tomorrow as a result of listening to us talk about it, maybe, and people hear it in 10 years' time. And that thing of you make a record in a moment where you are at that time as a snapshot of who you are as a musician. And then I think it was Gabe Witcher said to me, he said, you never really know what record you're making when you make it. Oh. It's only when you look back that you sort of know what it was.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a good point. I think you shine a light on an important point. Like, everybody's entitled to their window in, I like to say. Like, some people come to me and say, wow, that stuff you did with David Grisman, the hot dog record, that was awesome, And I want to say, no, the stuff David did before I joined the band was the real shit, because that's what inspired me and blew the top of my head off, or Newgrass Revival, their first record. That was my thing. But, of course, many people discovered them after Bela Fleck was in the band. So, and that's hopefully people will care, will notice this stuff many years later and see it as something of value. I hope so.
And it's that interesting thing about listening to stuff. So I might listen to this record and listen to something one of you did last year at the same time. Like, you discover stuff out of chronology as well. So that's why I find that whole conversation at the beginning about where you both were in your musical journeys, I find that really interesting, because you don't need to know that to enjoy a record. But when you slot it into the timeline as well, it often just opens up another perspective. And
yeah, I think you have a period for, I had been playing jazz and bebop quite a lot, having hung out with Darrell Anger and the Turtle Island String Quartet in the late 70s when they were exploring playing jazz on string instruments. So I had some knowledge of that. I think when you look at a tune like Scrapple from the Apple or Crab Feathers, that you could argue that was one of Chris's first forays into really exploring what he thought his voice through jazz changes, and then also the Bach, I think it was the first time he'd recorded any Bach. I had been into Shoro music pretty deeply at that point. I think you'll have to help me with the timeline. I think I had already recorded Brazil duets. Yeah. And maybe even my Shoro group had a record out. So I think what was most fascinating about this was how quickly we could have an idea, either one of us, and the other person do the idea. And so it was really easy for us to sift through arrangement ideas and try them out and then record them right away. Whereas with some musicians, you would have to really work on something for a long time. With somebody like Chris, you just say, hey, could you harmonize that? It's like, yeah, give me a second. Yeah, okay, I'm good. And that's literally it. Or, gee, maybe you got an idea for a counterpoint. Can you just do a descending line that runs down from the top of your mandolin down to the bottom while I'm playing this? Oh, yeah, sure. And that's a real luxury, to be working with a musician like that.
And there are some tracks on here that are very much sort of led by an idea, but not confined by, exactly you say, that idea is able to be exploited. So obviously Shamrock Shore with the harmonics, What a Blast with the sort of the outer string things. But there's also, which track am I thinking of? There's something else as well. There is. Yeah. I was thinking of that, but I was also thinking of, is it Scrapple from the Apple that starts with you playing alternate notes on the melody?
Alternate notes on the melody. I mean, that's an insanely difficult thing to do.
Right, but you did it, but it's not a party trick. It's
and it's so silly because I listened to it with headphones on, and I almost couldn't tell if we were really doing that. But of course, live, it's really effective, and I remember that was tricky for both of us, I have to admit. And what a crazy idea, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that was so fun with Chris. It's that you could have an idea like that and just give it a moment, and it would come together. Or the ending where it goes into da 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 da. It's kind of a John Coltrane move, harmonically. And then let's harmonize that. Okay. And then let's record it. Okay.
Yeah.
That was the swiftness with which working with Chris was possible. It's really fun, really easy.
And it's interesting you mentioned Stranded in Kodiak, because that's one of the tracks I was going to single out to have a chat about, because there's so much going on in that track.
Do you know the story behind it?
So I heard you mention it was to do with Chris being stranded sort of post 9/11.
Yeah.
But I don't think I know more than that.
Yeah, it had just happened, and all flights were down for those 4 days or whatever it was. So, or maybe longer. So I think that he very well tapped into those feelings, especially during his solo. Anger, confusion, what the hell, fear. It's all kind of coming out, especially at the end there where he just has that repeated note when he's soloing. And me, I'm just trying to hold it down. I like to be a bass player. I love to feel like when somebody's soloing, they really feel comfort and they feel like I'm completely supporting them. Like to think I was able to provide that for him while he really was expressing something pretty deep and scary. So,
and it's an interesting space, because not that you would accuse Chris in any of his vocal music of kind of not letting his emotions out. He's explored loads of stuff in his songs, but there's something about instrumental music where you can express all sorts of emotions and only you need to know what they are. Mm-hmm. Like they can be less defined in a way.
Yeah, that's true.
And there's something beautiful about that, I think.
Yeah. And maybe I'm reading stuff into it. But, certainly as we started playing this music live, he went even further in some of the live shows. But yeah, that is interesting about instrumental music. Everyone can take into it and can read into it what you want. It doesn't have the, oh baby, you broke my heart. So in that way, it can go to more places. It's not limited by that. You might hear something and think, well, that's just funny, or that's just, that's very deep and meaningful and sad. And another person might read something completely different into it.
Yeah, and it's that track, you talk about that held note at the end, and there's so much, like, one of the things I love about music, or any kind of creative performance really, is at its best, it's about like organizing energy and how you build something, how you take a line and make it not straight and take somebody on a journey, whether it's up and down, side to side, even if you drop somebody off back at the same place they started, but they've just seen something they hadn't before. And that's such a perfect track for that. It just has it's such a trip to go on as a listener.
That's nice to hear. And that's, again, getting back to Chris's creativity. I mean, he was hearing something there. And what I like about it is that I'm just playing bass notes, and the chord structure is a little bit nebulous. It's not really clear. Is it major or minor? And is this note I'm playing in the bass, is that the tonic or is that the third of the chord? So it has this kind of feeling of instability in it, which is also rather nice. At the same time, it's got a very simple melody. So yeah, that's that one really stood out as something really unique for this kind of music. When I think of soloing and the two of us, how we were kind of pushing at each other without being competitive, we were definitely inspired. And if one of us did something really hot, the other one wanted to follow it with something great. But there's always this feeling of support. And even with all of that going on, there's always a feeling of complete joy when one or the other of us does something phenomenal. And like I said, getting back to the accompanying, always a feeling of complete support coming from the other person. no matter if you feel like, God, I wish I could do that. What he's playing right now. Very interesting. Great relationship in that way with Chris.
And it's something like, I almost, listening to the record, I almost feel like I can hear you listening to each other.
Well,
do you know what I mean? It's like, it's just, and then whether the lead follows the rhythm follows the lead, who it is suggests a particular direction you go and the other one follows. Like it's, it just sounds like such a...
Yeah, there's a lot of deep listening for sure, and on a microscopic level, and also on a bigger trajectory of where a certain solo is going. A real sense of the company was hearing that and following that dynamic or what have you. Also, one of the things we tried to not do, which is atypical of these kind of jamming records. When a soloist starts doing something rhythmically and the rhythm player starts copying that can be great if it generates more energy, but it can also be a wet blanket depending on the situation where you might want that rhythmic counterpoint. So it's not something Chris and I ever really talked about, but I felt like we've found a balance for that. Especially in a duet setting, it's real easy to get caught up in whatever somebody's saying you want to say it to. Instead of laying back and letting that soloist say it.
One of the things that you definitely get from listening to Chris's music, and I presume I've heard him say this at some point, I must have done, but he likes a bit of friction in music. And it's exactly as you say, I guess, if one of you just follows the other one everywhere they go, you lose that bit of tension that exists between not doing the same thing. And tension and release in music is one of the most beautiful things in music. Yeah,
I think that was something that it maintained the kind of listenability to the record that I think both of us were trying to be real conscious of, even though we were pushing ourselves instrumentally beyond what any of us had ever done up to that point. We were still very conscious of hearing the music as an outsider.
And the sound of the record, there's something about the sound of that record as well. You've got two, apart from the Mandocello tracks, you've got two potentially fairly small sounding instruments that don't tend to sustain. Like a mandolin as a way of creating a sound, it's a pretty inefficient thing, right? And so part of it is obviously you both playing beautiful instruments with great tone, and you both have great tone as players. But there's also an element that is added to that by the way you chose to add the reverb.
Yeah, are you aware of how we did it in the series?
Yeah, I've heard you talk about that.
Yeah, we recorded in a very dead room, just facing each other, knee to knee, basically. And so I took the tapes after I edited it together and went into a church with some really nice speakers and put Chris into one speaker and me into the other, and just played that in that hall and captured that air, So much nicer than digital reverb, it's just, and the two speakers blend together into the room and it creates this time delay that is more natural to the way it would be if we were playing in that church. So that was really, I done it also with the record I did with Daryl Anger, live record called, At Home and on the Range. Yeah, in that same church, in Berkeley, Unitarian church there right by the campus. Great big room. I think we had two mics about 10 feet away and another two mics 60 feet away or something. Recorded on ADATs. You remember those?
Yeah.
Pre-Pro.
But it's like I'd always, from the first time I heard Into the Cauldron, the sound of that reverb was always something that struck my ear. But I only found out, I think, about 2 weeks ago that that's how you'd done it. And it just reminded me something I'd read about how Norman Petty had recorded Buddy Holly. And so he was basically after the same thing. And he had, when he moved his studio to Clovis, I think it was his dad's house next door or something. And they used the A-frame attic section of that house with a speaker in a big wooden box at one end. 100 feet away was a microphone. And they sort of put, Buddy Holly's family worked in the tiling business. So they put all these ceramic tiles in there, some bits of pipe tile to break up because the curves broke the kind of sound patterns. And they would they'd pump the sound out of the speaker, capture it in the mic, and feed it back into the board next door. So when you listen to Peggy Sue, that's the sound of the next door attic doing the reverb.
Fantastic.
I love that.
Well, in the old days, the big studios had real reverb chambers. They were basically brick cell blocks in the basement with a mic at one end and a speaker at the other. And that was your reverb. It sounds like it was much more sophisticated than that, but yeah, that's air, man, and that's something digital doesn't do that. It does something else. You can control it a lot more, but I think there's something magical about that. Copying a room.
And you say it was recorded in your garage, which was presumably treated to be pretty dead. Were you just sitting opposite each other with a couple of mics on you?
Yeah, I think I was trying to remember if we either had two KMs on each of us, KM84, the original KM84s, not the 184, because I had four of them. But I also love the Coles mic. I might have been one KM and one Coles on each of us. No other mics. Definitely two mics on each. I'd have to go back and look at the track sheets. Maybe I wrote it down somewhere. But yeah, that was it. Real straight ahead and to ADAT, which was, pretty good quality. It's all digital. Would have been nice to have been on tape, but this way we were able to keep lots of outtakes. I wish everyone could hear all the outtakes with all the solos, and it would be hilarious to see the music develop, listening to the 3 hours. We recorded each tune for about 3 hours.
There's a box set and a half.
Oh my God. There's piles of stuff laying around in my cellar somewhere.
And then all the recordings of the live shows you did together as well. Because I read somewhere that you recorded all those too.
Yeah, they're all there. So yeah, I'm not sure I'll ever go the route David Grisman has been going, where he's putting out everything. But who knows? Somebody just discovered this recording with Tony Rice, Todd Phillips, and Daryl and I playing at the Old Town School of Folk Music. So I put that one out. I was so surprised how good it sounded. It was just a board tape, but it was spectacular. Mm. The guy who was the engineer at that in those days kept every show and ended up donating it to is this guy Jan Johansson, great lover of bluegrass, has it all. So he's been going through it. It's fantastic.
I mean, it sort of speaks a little bit to your point earlier about like perfection in recording not necessarily being the most important thing. So there's things out there like I've just been talking about Clarence White with people for the last couple of months. Mm-hmm. And that Live in Sweden record that was just a fan recording in the room, like that's a document that is so loved by people.
I recently went back and listened to a bunch of him too, after hearing your interview with David Greer and the guys. And I don't think I got to that Sweden record. I'm going to have to dig in. Is it recorded really well?
Well, it's recorded, so you hear Clarence really loudly because whoever was there was obviously there to record Clarence. But it's just, you hear like a little gig in a fairly small club that happened 50 years ago, and somebody wanted to record it. And so now we have this, and I love it. I think it's a great sound. It's a really cool band, and you can hear them all like musically moving around each other in the most beautiful way. Yeah.
Well, as artists, we often have the sound in our head, and we record something, and it doesn't come out exactly like we were thinking it would. But it's real easy to forget that what did come out was actually great. And so shut up on your face.
Yeah, and that's art, isn't it? It's the best version of the thing you can try and get to. Like, I don't know who said it, but the idea that art is never completed. You just eventually choose to abandon it.
Yeah, that's it.
And you get it in as good shape as you can before you abandon it, and that's what the thing is.
I say it wasn't as good as we could do. It was as good as we could afford. And maybe by stopping, you actually kept from ruining it.
Yeah, I talked to Noam Pikelny about the Mighty Poplar record earlier in the year, and he said that they had it recorded and they'd done some rough mixes, and then they spent about 2 years mixing it, and he said we could have just put it out the next day, and it would have sounded great. You get to a certain point where, because they had to delay it coming out because they couldn't get together to tour it, they had the luxury of going back to it.
They kept fussing, huh?
Yeah, it said because you just get to a point where you think, well, we've got this time, we should use it.
Okay, well, maybe they tweaked out a few things. Hey, I understand. I completely understand. It never feels done. It always feels like just one more little thing could make it a little bit better. Well, especially I'm recording all this Bach stuff these days on the mandocello, and that's a very deep well. It does not ever end.
Yeah. And it's interesting, we sort of circles back to what we were talking about at the beginning, really, about where you both were in your journeys and like that. And you were saying about some of this being Chris's first real exploration into playing through jazz changes and playing Bach. And like even the idea that if the two of you sat in the same room with the same two instruments today and recorded these 11 tracks, they'd sound totally different.
Well, gee, that's a really interesting idea. I wonder where we would go with this material. Yeah. It would be totally different, and in that way, I'm really lucky that I grabbed it when we were at this super exciting time together as buddies. Me sharing all the things I knew as the elder statesman, and his endless enthusiasm, which has not seemed to diminish a bit in all these years, and just blasting off, just bouncing off each other in that way. But at the same time, we come from exactly the same background. I think that was also part of what made the rhythmic thing blend so well. Is that especially having done things with like Hamilton de Holanda, who comes from a very different tradition, or working with Katerina, you have really different feelings for even the simple idea of how you play a group of 16th notes in a row. With Chris and I, it was just like complete meld from the first notes. We felt the groove the same way. So that really brought things together. What do you think of the title and the cover?
I was talking to Jarrod about that. Jarrod was like, I first heard this and I had the CD, and even the trench coats that were on the cover was really cool. And like, and all of the, it's hard to know with a record like that what to put on the cover, isn't it?
Well, I'm a lover of food, and especially living in the Bay Area, all these grocery stores are just so phenomenal. And boy, do I miss them now that I'm in Germany in the wintertime. And so I was a total food and wine guy, and I think I dragged Chris into a lot of that. He was young, and so also, I mean, to me, it has a couple of different meanings. On one level, it's like you're making the soup with all these different ingredients. So the CD is like a cauldron of soup, vegetables and fruits and everything is going in there. At the same time, it was kind of I could say it now, Chris grew up very Christian. And so this was in some way his stepping out into the bad realm, and we were like witches. Maybe I was the witch, dragging him down the road of doom, as it were, into, some of the first real nice wine drinking and cheese eating and appreciation for the good life in a way that maybe he didn't grow up with. So I love the title in that regard. It's probably just me.
Well, but there is also, like as an outsider who's not seeing that context, but the idea of just a cauldron as like you say, a melting pot and a place where stuff, but also there's the idea of there being a bit of witchcraft in there. And it is, I've talked to so many incredible musicians through this podcast, and I fully intellectually understand the idea that we're all on the same journey. It's just some are further down the road. And I know that intellectually Brian Sutton is where he is because he's put in the work day in, day out for years and years and years. But there are moments of listening to Into the Cauldron where you are just going like, I don't know, that's not humanly possible. That's witchcraft. And so it's sort of, there's a little bit of like magic to it as well.
Well, I mean, Tony Rice said that, you start asking guys about their pick and what kind of strings you use, and wow, that rhythmic syncopation you do is so cool. And, Tony would sometimes just boil it down and say, you know what, there's some stuff in music that is unexplainable. It's just magic. And I think that's why we love music, because there were things with playing with Chris live. There were things that happened on stage in the middle of songs that was just like, this is weird. This is transcending everything we practiced. This is transcending everything we thought we could do or ever even wanted to do at this moment, right here, right now. That, what just happened right there is what is going on. Whether it was, sometimes we would start a second set with just free improvisation. Of course, that was those kind of things. Almost inevitably, you go to that place if you're really in the right headspace for it. But it would happen in the middle of somebody's solo tune in an already arranged tune. I just believe in it. I think that's what music is for, is trying to get to that place. You cannot quantify all of it. There's some stuff. Whether somebody can do a row of triplets for, 6 bars instead of 3, well, that's cool, and that blows your mind, and you go, oh my God, and he landed on the downbeat. Okay, but that's like juggling 9 pins and not dropping one. This other stuff is more intriguing to me. Why is it that when Clarence White anticipates that downbeat, the top of your head comes off? Now, you can try anticipating it, but it ain't going to have the same effect, right? Every time.
And it's like that moment in Scrapple from the Apple where you're alternating notes. You could do a whole piece of that and it could be remarkably technically impressive. But you use it as a jumping off point to then dive into something deeper. And it's those are the moments. And I think it's Julian Lage sort of talks about all the work you put in is essentially constructing a parachute. So when you hurl yourself off the cliff, you think you're probably going to be okay.
That's a good way to think of it. That's a really good way to think of it. Yeah.
And then you just become confident hurling yourself off the musical cliffs because you'll be all right.
Yeah, I was talking to my students about that online too, about especially improvising through a set of more interesting chord changes that you don't always play through. When it goes to A flat, why is it that all of us mandolin players have this one or maybe 2 areas on the fingerboard where we can survive? How do we break out of that? And I have a whole series of things that deal with that. That you should be comfortable playing an A flat scale starting with your second finger on the 6th fret of a D string, even though it feels like a whole tone scale up there. It's an area where you might end up one day because of what you did just before it, and you shouldn't feel lost at that moment. You should be able to continue the melodic train of thought that you were on. So that's probably what Julian's talking about. I'll be okay if it goes to A flat. even if I'm up here in this weird zone on the instrument.
Yeah, and that's one of the joys of, I think, the many joys of this record is just hearing two people, like you were saying, who can take the ideas and follow wherever the other one goes. You can go with them. There's no kind of, you better go there on your own because I can't go.
Yeah, no, that's true. I'll tell you what, though, there was some stuff that was a real challenge for both of us. Like those chord changes on, what's the tune? The really weird tune, Something Quite Trifling. Those are some wicked changes to blow through, man. I mean, it kicked both our asses, And sometimes I feel like we were just practicing doing something like that, and we would just trade, Had to do a lot of work to get to where we could work our way through those chords and still survive them. I don't know why. Like it's like A flat to D7. It shouldn't be that weird, or I don't know. I forget what they even were, but sometimes a half step away is really far because it throws your fingers into it scrambles.
Well, we're so used to thinking of these sort of cycle of fifths, down a fifth or fourth or whatever, and it's an easy way of thinking, isn't it? But it's very easy to get lost. And it's just all of that is what makes this record as vital to listen to now as it was when I first heard it. And it's a joyous listen. And I think it's a bit weird going through things looking for anniversaries as an excuse to talk about things, but it's as an arbitrary, a useful way as I can think of. And it's so cool to get to talk about this record.
Well,
you have to listen to it for 15 years or whatever.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for shining a light back on it and bringing it back to my attention. I'm glad some of these young mandolin pickers appreciate it, and hopefully they'll take it as a jumping off point and not as a final goal, and take it to the next level beyond where this can go. There's a lot of them out there who I'm sure could do it.
Yeah, totally. And it's like a sort of great musical relay race, isn't it? Is you take the baton from whoever's had it before and you hope you carry it a bit further to give to somebody else. And so it continues. Right
on. Or at least walk it in a different direction.
Cool. That's great, Mike.
I hope we got something. Feels like we do.
Loads of good stuff in there.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you.